I'm in Idaho. Every summer, these forests burn, and every winter they get buried in snow. Rain comes from the ocean, but that's hundreds of miles away. And on top of all that, it doesn't rain that much out here. Everything I've learned about rainforests tells me that this shouldn't be one. But I look around, and this is a rainforest if I've ever seen one. It's the start of the 1800s, and Europeans are making their first explorations of northwestern North America. They're looking for new places to trap furs, and for the Northwest Passage, a fabled water route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. The Northwest Company has sent out David Thompson to map the region, make contact with indigenous groups, and establish fur trading posts. He's the first European to explore these mountains. He ascends the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, begins the descent down the western slope, and describes what feels like stepping into a different world. The climate warms, snow turns to rain, and the trees become massive. He sees raging rivers fed entirely by melting snow, with vast stocks of beavers and salmon, forests packed with moose, bald eagles, wolves, mountain lions, grizzly bears. And he ponders the systems allowing this place to even exist. What may be the volume of water contained in the immense quantities of snow brought to the mountains from the Pacific Ocean? These are mysterious operations on a scale so vast that the human mind is lost in the contemplation. Well, 200 years later, scientists are still contemplating. Temperate rainforests cover less than 1% of the Earth's surface. The largest and most famous is the coastal rainforest of the Pacific Northwest, the Redwoods, Olympic, Vancouver Island. Here, weather systems from the Pacific smother the coastal mountains with near constant rain and fog. So much that by the time these weather systems pass the coast, they're not done yet. They keep moving inland, eventually running into the western slopes of the Columbia and Rocky Mountains. 12,000 years ago, ice sheets covered these mountains, carving high peaks and deep, smooth valleys below them. As Pacific weather systems reach these mountains, they drop rain in the spring and buckets of snow in the winter. That snow melts in the summer, draining into the deepest valleys and keeping the soil moist despite frequent summer droughts and wildfires. And it's in these deepest valleys where moisture accumulates that we find the oldest forests, allowed to evade wildfires for hundreds or even thousands of years and develop into a lush, old-growth, temperate rainforest. This forest exists in patches across Washington, Montana, and Idaho, and reaches its fullest extent further north in British Columbia. With 98% of the world's temperate rainforests being coastal, the inland temperate rainforest is something completely unique. A vast temperate rainforest more than 500 kilometers from the ocean, and the world's only rainforest deriving a large portion of its moisture from snow. All of that melting snow has resulted in a landscape connected by hundreds of waterways, wetlands, streams, lakes, and the headwaters for 3 major rivers. Well, I'm in Idaho, but certainly doesn't feel like it. Feels more like the coast, maybe Oregon or Vancouver Island.
This region doesn't just experience the weather that you would expect near the coast, it has nearly the exact same species. These forests are dominated by western red cedar and western hemlock, trees mostly found on the coast. The same goes for most of the shrubs, ferns, and mosses found here, a lot of the birds, most mammals, and especially lichens. The inland rainforest has one of the richest lichen communities of any temperate forest, and so many of these species are found nowhere except here and the coast. So how did all of these species make this leap several hundred kilometers inland? These forests are believed to have formed between 6,000 and 2,000 years ago, working their way north after the retreat of the ice. Perhaps they had existed in small patches south of the ice, expanding north as the climate warmed. Or maybe they came from the coast, following isolated migration routes inland. There's evidence for both, and we're not quite sure. The These old forests provide habitat for gray wolves, mountain lions, moose, ospreys, herons, rare bats, rare frogs and salamanders found only here, a brand new slug just discovered in 2018. The colder forests at higher elevations are home to lynx and wolverines, and the alpine tundra above is home to mountain goats and pikas. The waterways are home to river otters, beavers, and Pacific salmon. Each year, millions of salmon swim hundreds of miles upstream to spawn, bringing nutrients from the ocean with them. Bald eagles and grizzly bears eat the salmon, dragging them through the trees, and allowing this entire forest to be nourished by these nutrients from the ocean more than 500 kilometers away. All right, I love big trees. I just spotted these two absolute chunkers on the other side of the creek. Look at this thing. That's huge. Another big one over here. Nuts. Several indigenous groups have made use of this rainforest, selectively harvesting western red cedar and turning it into homes, canoes, cookware, and other tools. They harvested fruits, vegetables, berries, nuts, seeds, mushrooms, tea, and salmon. They spent winters in these deep, sheltered valleys, used the region's rivers as a transportation network, and traded with other indigenous groups in the coastal rainforest, hundreds of kilometers away. The inland rainforest's strangest inhabitant is the mountain caribou. Most caribou are found in the tundras further north, migrating vast distances in large herds and digging for plants and lichens beneath the snow. During the winter, the mountain caribou will almost exclusively eat rainforest lichens found high in the canopy, using the deep winter snowpack as a stepladder to access what would normally be out of reach. They travel in small groups and migrate vertically, moving seasonally between the high mountains and the lush valleys below. And their habitat range coincides so closely with the boundaries of the inland rainforest that scientists consider them an indicator for the health of the entire ecosystem. Mountain caribou survive by hiding, traversing vast, rugged areas to avoid predators. This forest, with its steep slopes and dense vegetation, is the perfect hiding place. As we move into the next part of this video, everything we've just talked about is going to change, and you're going to see that this rainforest story is playing out right now. Decisions are currently being made that will decide this ecosystem's future. So my research for this story includes plenty of books and studies, but also a wide range of news articles about those decisions. And that's where Ground News comes in. Ground News is the sponsor of this video. It's a website and an app that aggregates news stories from all around the world. It tells you about different outlets' political leanings, their credibility and factuality, and even who they're owned by. Recently, the Biden administration banned new offshore drilling projects for most of the US coastline. This story's been covered by 477 sources, with a pretty even mix of left and right leaning, and many in the center. Alternet on the left focuses on the benefits for ocean conservation, while right-leaning Fox Business focuses on the criticism from industry. One cool feature is blind spots, which highlights stories disproportionately covered by one side of the political aisle. Like this story from just a couple weeks ago about the Forest Service withdrawing a plan to strengthen protections of old-growth forests. This story is actually very relevant to this video. You'll see that later on. These tools are helping me to broaden the stories that I'm consuming and stay more informed on environmental, science, and just general news. Right now, Ground News is offering 40% off of their Vantage plan using the link in the description of this video. That's all of the tools we just talked about for just $5 a month. That link is ground.news/Aidin, or you can just scan the QR code on screen. It's thanks to sponsors like Ground News that I can go to these places and tell these stories. So thank you again for making this one possible and just helping me to stay informed. Following Thompson's expeditions, fur trading dominated this region's economy until the mid-1800s, when mining booms brought a new wave of settlers to the Rockies. They cleared small sections of forest to build homes and farms, mostly in these fertile and easily accessible valleys. They hunted caribou and fished for salmon. and they set up small sawmills to supply local communities. In the late 1800s, railroads crossed the Rocky Mountains, opening this region for more intensive settlement. Since the 1860s, the country's timber industry had been concentrated around the Great Lakes, much of it under the control of a single company called Weyerhaeuser. But by the end of the century, the forests around the Great Lakes had been depleted, and timber companies were looking for new land elsewhere. They heard of a vast, untouched forest in the Northwest, and began buying up huge chunks of land, and buying up these small local sawmills. They even set up fake homesteads, paying settlers to build crude shacks at the intersection of 4 plots of land, forging documents to qualify all 4 as homesteads, and then logging the land. In just a few years, the timber industry had acquired vast sections of forest, but with rugged terrain and no roads, harvesting it seemed impossible. The solution was to use the countless waterways connecting this region. They started with trees on the edges of lakes and rivers, dumping them in the water to be floated to sawmills downstream. Logs would often get stuck and pile up, so men nicknamed river pigs guided them downstream, wearing spiked boots to walk on top of the logs as they rolled, breaking up log jams, sometimes using dynamite to do so, and risking drowning or being crushed if they slipped in. Once the timber at the water's edge was gone, they pushed deeper into the forest, targeting the most accessible sites in the lowest valleys, and building small railroads and water flumes to move logs to the riverbanks. Loggers worked in temporary camps, moving from site to site as forests were depleted. They worked 10-hour days, 6 days a week, sleeping on straw mattresses in tents or crude bunkhouses, and unable to bathe or do laundry. Within a decade, timber had become the region's main industry, with more than 300 sawmills employing half of the people living here, and companies continuing to merge and buy land. At the same time, the Roosevelt administration was investigating fraud, indicting companies and politicians, and working with the newly created Forest Service to create tens of millions of acres of national forests, including 10 right here in the inland rainforest. By the 1910s, timber companies had already spent millions of dollars just accessing these forests. Shipping wood out of Idaho was expensive, and demand for lumber in the US was falling, but supply and competition continued to rise. Timber companies tried to compensate by cutting faster, but that just sank prices even more. And that was all before the Great Depression. Mills closed, large timber companies declared bankruptcy, and the timber industry in the inland rainforest dried up. The Second World War brought a renewed demand for lumber. Bulldozers, trucks, and retired military machinery allowed access to more remote locations. A vast network of forest roads began to cut through this region. Loggers switched from harvesting individual trees to clear-cutting entire stands. Faster harvests and roads connecting the region allowed for even more consolidation of the industry into fewer and larger companies, and the disappearance of even more local mills. Within a few decades, privately owned forests in the Northwest were depleted, so timber companies started putting pressure on the Forest Service to significantly ramp up logging in the national forests. And they did. At the same time, a conservation movement was growing in the US. Scientists and economists were publishing reports that the national forests were being overcut, and citizens were protesting. The eventual result was a dramatic reduction of logging in national forests, but much of the damage was already done. Today in Idaho, old-growth forests exist in small patches, separated by clear cuts, uniform stands of young trees, and forest roads. Dams have flooded vast sections of rainforest, submerging valleys and ending the salmon migration in several rivers. Indigenous groups have been driven from their traditional territories, with some communities wiped out entirely. Only a small handful of grizzly bears remain in Idaho, and in 1983, mountain caribou were listed as endangered, with fewer than 30 animals in the South Selkirk herd, the only herd in the US. Those that survive continue to do so by hiding in the most remote valleys and the mountains above. Now remember, what makes mountain caribou so unique is that their main food source is canopy lichens, and many of these lichen species only grow in old-growth forests. So the lichen are dependent on the oldest forests. The caribou are dependent on the lichen, and across the region, much of the rainforest that is protected has been set aside as caribou habitat. So without the caribou, those protections can be removed. The result is this ecological house of cards. Lose the oldest forests, and you lose the rest too. Logging and replanting forests creates what are called early seral ecosystems, places with small trees and shrubs, the very beginning of a forest. These provide nothing for caribou, but they're perfect food for deer and moose. Widespread conversion of old growth to young forests has resulted in booming populations of deer and moose, which means more prey for wolves and mountain lions, so their populations have grown too. And wolves and mountain lions also eat caribou. So as these forests have become increasingly fragmented, caribou have been pushed into smaller pockets of old growth forest with less food, surrounded by more predators. In 2019, a female caribou was captured near the Idaho-Canada border and relocated to a recovery program further north. The last caribou gone from the contiguous United States. The good news is that this story isn't over. Further north, in British Columbia, where this forest is at its biggest and best, large chunks of old-growth forest still make up much of the landscape. The caribou and grizzly bears are still here, and the ecosystem is still intact. For now. Since the 1970s, the rate of logging here has doubled, most of it coming from old-growth forests. And since 1990, mountain caribou populations have been cut in half, with fewer than 1,500 remaining. Some of Canada's first national parks were in this region, and more than 700,000 acres of caribou habitat have been protected. Just last year, British Columbia protected a 750 square kilometer area, including old-growth forests and caribou habitat. But even if we stopped logging the inland rainforest tomorrow, the large areas of connected old forest required for a stable caribou population will take decades to develop. By the time their habitat regenerates, the caribou will already be gone. So, governments, conservation groups, and several of British Columbia's First Nations have begun experimenting with intervention. This study from last year analyzed the various methods for boosting caribou populations and found one method that consistently worked: killing wolves. With a lot of conservation debates focusing on the reintroduction of wolves and other large predators, this is quite the reversal, and it's been met with plenty of controversy. Other interventions include supplemental feeding and transferring pregnant caribou to enclosures where they can safely give birth. Ultimately, the biggest finding from this study is that intervention works. It's just a matter of choosing whether or not we want to apply it. The ball is in Canada's court, but the US is not off the hook. Old-growth forests have pretty good protections down here, but mature forests don't. These are the forests that are almost back to old-growth conditions, and timber continues to be harvested from them. Over the last 2 years, the Forest Service has been preparing an amendment strengthening their old-growth protections, and more than 1 million Americans have asked them to include mature forests as well. But just a couple weeks ago, rather than announcing such an amendment, they abruptly dropped the entire plan. Right now, we are collectively deciding how we should engage with this forest. And standing here, I feel it too. I'm hundreds of miles from the ocean, but drops of it are falling. Salmon will bring its nutrients to these streams. Bears and eagles will move those nutrients into this forest. This forest will grow lichens in its canopy. Caribou will eat those lichens to survive. And their survival may decide what my species chooses to do with this entire ecosystem. This place feels so connected. Every piece of it fits together so well. And then there's me. I travel on logging roads and maintain trails. I tread carefully but imperfectly. And sometimes I look around and wonder, what am I doing here? I believe others must have felt this too. The fur trappers, the loggers, the scientists. They must have felt this place around them and asked the same questions. What are we doing here? What should we do here? What will we do here? And whoever ends up answering those questions, deciding what we'll do with the world's strangest rainforest. I hope they felt this too.